Hey guys, and welcome back to another mystery video on my channel. Today's video is about a case that is known both as the Muskoka Mysteries and the Cottage Country Murders, and it takes place in Muskoka in Ontario in Canada. And Muskoka is a beautiful, beautiful place, like I said, in Ontario, that is known for its beautiful, huge bodies of water, and it is where a lot of people have cottages and summer homes. But between the years of 1994 to the early 2000s, something very sinister was taking place there. In 1994, the Lawrence family, consisting of Catherine, her brothers David, Walter, Paul, and their uncle Ron Allen, had decided to go into the retirement home business. The Lawrence family was known as being a very generous, giving, charitable Christian family who was very, very involved in their community. So when everybody found out that they were going into the retirement home business, they thought this was just another way for them to give back. Previously to opening a retirement home, David was actually working at a hospital in Toronto, and Catherine worked on the board of directors, and Paul and Walter were both plumbers, so they were very involved in their community. Not only that way, but they were very, very involved in the church, like I said before, so they were a well-known family. After deciding to go into the retirement home business, they had bought 3 properties to which the Lands had planned on running these retirement homes out of. So one of these retirement homes would be run by Catherine, one would be run by Catherine, Walter, and Paul, and the last one, which is the one I'm going to be talking about the most, was run by David and Ron Allen. And this one is called Fern, Glen, Manor, but I will be referring to it as the farm. When they started running these retirement homes to get people to come and stay at them, Walter and David would go into Toronto to homeless shelters and not very nicely run retirement homes where they would advertise their homes to the folks living there. And they would tell them that they were very nicely run Christian retirement homes with trained dietitians, trained doctors, all of that kind of stuff to cater to their every needs on a beautiful lake. And who wouldn't want to live out their older years on a beautiful lake with somebody catering to your every needs? It sounds absolutely fabulous.
Were you aware of the retirement homes?
Yes.
What did you know about them?
Yes. She would go to Toronto and find people who had no connection to any other people, really, and she would entice them and say, you know, I have a nice retirement home up north, and it's a beautiful place.
But the Lands had a darker motive behind who they were advertising their retirement homes to. They only wanted folks to come and stay with them who had large pensions coming in. And the retirement homes were not all that they were cracked up to be. Joanne Lawrence was born in 1921 in Ottawa, Ontario, where she lived out her younger years. She got married and started to make money as a poet. But in the year of 1963, her and her husband had decided to get a divorce, and that is when Joanne decided to move to Muskoka. Joanne just really wanted a more laid-back lifestyle. She didn't have any kids, and after divorcing her husband, she didn't have much family. So when she moved to Muskoka, she started taking in stray cats. And people who knew her said that she treated these cats like her children and referred to them as her family. She really loved them, and because of this, people started to refer to her as the cat lady. In Joanne's older years, she had moved into the Land's retirement homes. And originally, she was living in the home run by Catherine, but she had then started to claim that this home was stealing her pension. So the Lands had gotten together and decided to move Joanne to the farm. This particular property homed 3 to 4 seniors at a time on a huge farmland. But this was not your average retirement home. And these homes were described as being extremely, extremely run down. And it was absolutely not what the Lands had promised these folks. In 1998, police got wind of the fact that the Lands had a woman living on the farm property in a tool shed. And when police came to investigate this situation, they had found Joanne living inside of a very small tool shed with no running water, no heat, no lights. It was just basically boards stuck together with 30 cats. And if you know what winter is like in Ontario, especially up towards Muskoka, you know how crazy it is for somebody to be living in literally a tool shed all year round. And Joanne was paying $700 a month to live in this shed. Immediately, the police had contacted Adult Protective Services, who were working with Joanne to find her a new place to live, but this proved to be a little bit difficult as Joanne would not leave behind her 30 cats. I'm not sure why the Lands establishments weren't shut down right then and there. I mean, I'm sure they could have been charged with something, but they weren't, and this case just continues to grow and get much, much worse. Around the same time that police had found Joanne living in a shed, she was also working with lawyers to build a case about the fact that somebody had been filing her income taxes without her permission. So they were getting in contact with police and trying to build a case around this. But in early October, when the lawyers had contacted Joanne to tell her that she needed to come in and sign the police papers, she never showed up. And this is where a lot more dark information starts to come to light. Joanne had actually told a social worker that if anything ever happened to her, to contact the police. She also confided in a grocer that she talked to on a weekly basis that her landlords had taunted her by stepping on her cats. And she was also known to bathe in this grocery store washroom. And this same grocer had asked her, why are you bathing in here? Why don't you bathe at Ron Allen's house, which was on the property that Joanne lived in? And she had said, and I quote, "because you never know what he'll do," whatever that means. She had also gone down to the post office and informed them and instructed them not to release her mail to anybody except her. Police had also discovered that Joanne and David had a shared bank account, and David actually had a bank card to this account when Joanne herself didn't, which seemed odd because it was originally under her name. And David also continued to use this bank account once Joanne had gone missing. And keep in mind that none of the Lands had ever reported Joanne missing from the property. David, of course, was interviewed multiple times and asked where Joanne was. And every single time he was interviewed by investigators or asked about where Joanne was by other people, he would tell them a completely different story, and none of these stories ever checked out. In December of 1998, when police came to investigate where Joanne had been living, all of her stuff had been cleared out of the shed, and police were informed by another resident of the farm that Joanne's clothes had all been burned. And when police began to investigate the property, they had eventually found all 30 of Joanne's cats shot to death. And this seems very strange. I mean, if Joanne didn't want to leave her cats to move to a nicer place, why would she leave them willingly now? It just doesn't add up. Investigators now believe that the Lands had killed Joanne to keep her from coming forward to report the abuse and fraud that she was undergoing living on the Lands property. The Lands had over 20 residents living in all 3 of their establishments combined. And these establishments obviously weren't very well run. They didn't have trained doctors, they didn't have chefs, they didn't have anything that they had claimed that they were going to have at the beginning. And these residents were all charged $400 and up to live in these establishments. And some of the residents had actually come forward to investigators and had told them that they were served craft dinner for every single meal. They had also told investigators that they were not allowed to have access to phones, and they were only allowed to go into town when they were accompanied by either the Lands or one of their other shady employees.
I was taken back by the condition of the place and the conditions that they had to live in. In the room next was an old man just laying in bed. He was just laying there moaning and groaning. It just seemed very strange to me that this man would just be in an open room moaning and groaning, and thought to myself, boy, if my grandfather was here, he'd be going in the truck with me right now.
Almost all of the Lands residents had informed investigators that the Lands were stealing their money, and the Lands had also gained access to majority of their residents' bank accounts. And if things had broken, like the furnace or anything like that inside of the retirement home, and somebody had complained to ask to have it fixed, the Lands would make them pay for it out of their own pocket. And this is when police started to believe that they were dealing with a homicide investigation. But Muskoka is covered in dense woods and deep overgrown lakes, which is a very good place to hide a body, but not a very good place to find one. And this is when it had also come to the light that the Lands were not the nice Christian family that they had portrayed themselves to be. And in fact, Catherine, David, and Walter all had criminal records. David had previously been charged with breaking and entering. Walter was also charged with breaking and entering, but it is not related to David's charge. Walter was also charged with theft and impersonating an officer. Catherine was charged with extortion, possession, and theft. So as you can see, they were not the family that they had portrayed themselves to be at all. And when police started to investigate the Lands and the property that they had lived on, this is when all of the Lands had started to sell their properties and move away. And I think that this is odd because I thought that when you were under investigation for something, you actually had to stay in that area. But in this case, that was not the case. In 1998, Catherine had sold her land and moved to the States. And in 1999, Walter had sold his land and moved to the other side of Ontario. And in 2000, Paul had sold his land and moved to Alberta. David and Ron Allen couldn't actually be tracked down once they had sold their land at this particular time, but it had seemed that them almost being charged in a murder investigation had just vanished. When police were investigating Joanne Lawrence's disappearance, they had interviewed a lot of the residents at all of the land's establishments. And that is when they had interviewed a man by the name of Ralph Grant. Ralph hadn't lived in the old age home for a very long time, but he needed 24-hour care as he couldn't bathe himself or feed himself, and he had a lot of trouble speaking due to mouth surgery that he had. But when the police had talked to him the first time, he must have said something interesting because they had returned to speak to him again.
Ralph Grant, Doogie as he was known to friends, was one of them.
He was fast and furious, for want of a word. He always seemed to be on the go.
In his younger years, Doogie was a man about town in the automotive parts business. But his nephew Howard Grant says by his late 60s he'd fallen on hard times. He was told by police that Doogie was one of those recruited by the Land family while living in a homeless shelter in downtown Toronto.
By the time police had returned to speak to Ralph, all of the Land's retirement establishments were shut down. And all of the seniors were actually moved to another seniors home with a much more compassionate environment. But when police arrived to talk to Ralph, he was not among the people that were moved to this home. And when they'd asked the owner where he was, she had told them that she was under the impression that another officer had placed Ralph in a different seniors home somewhere else. This is when investigators started to notice that Joanne Lawrence wasn't the only person that had gone missing under the Land's care. Now Ralph Grant was also missing and could not be tracked down, but there was also another man by the name of John Cost who had moved into one of the Land's retirement establishments in 1997 and now had not been seen since early 1998. There was also another man by the name of John Semple who did not live in the retirement homes for a very long time as he moved there in January and had been missing since March.
70-something John Crofts, a shoe salesman from Toronto. Irish-born farm worker John Semple in his early 90s. And Ralph Grant, 70 years old, from Nova Scotia, known as Doogie.
The Lands had never reported any of these people missing, and after they had vanished, their pension checks were actually still being cashed by someone. The first person to be charged in 2001 was Walter's wife, and she had been charged with fraud, and her victim was one of the residents of the Land's retirement homes. Catherine was also charged with fraud after she was caught cashing one of her previous residents' checks. Ron, Walter, and Paul were all charged together, and they were all charged with 6 counts of fraud and 6 counts of theft. And for reasons unknown, David's charges were actually dropped. But among the long list of people who the Lands had stolen from, Ralph Grant, John Semple, and John Cost were all on the list as well. Nobody has been charged in the disappearance of these 4 people, and no bodies have ever been found. And on multiple occasions when the Lands were questioned by investigators, they had told them that a certain police officer had information and knew where these people were. And that makes me question if there was some shady police activity going on at this time. And it is not just because the Lands had said that one of these police officers knew where these people were, but also because the woman who owned the new retirement home had told investigators that she was under the impression that this same officer had moved Ralph Grant. In 2009, Walter was arrested for violent robberies against senior citizens, in which time he had also made sexual gestures at a lot of them. He was released in 2013 and arrested again in 2014 for breaking and entering, but was released in 2017 and the charges were dropped. Walter and David now live in North York in Toronto and run a gas station where they offer seniors discounts. Paul lives in South Korea with his wife, where he is a teacher at a university. And Catherine was teaching in Barrie, but once the school had gotten news of who she was fired, and now she is reported to have lived all over Canada and all over the States. Ron could never be tracked down, but it is believed that he is living a quiet life in Orillia, Ontario. This case is absolutely disgusting. I don't understand how the Lance family were only charged with fraud. I mean, they had people living in rundown shacks they were not taken care of, they were being abused, they weren't being fed properly, and the only charges that they faced were in fraud. I don't know if this was bad police work or lack of evidence, I'm not sure, but this case is absolutely disgusting, and I hope that the Lands get pegged for either something different or for the disappearance of these people, because justice needs to be served. This is absolutely horrendous that they're just out there living life while so many people had suffered at their hand. And guys, that brings us to the end of this video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and also comment down below what you'd like to see in my future videos, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye guys!